Bon, j'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que je suis situé en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. Je reconnais la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles je suis aujourd'hui. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations entre les peuples autochtones et les autres personnes au Canada. Je vous remercie vraiment d'être ici aujourd'hui. Je pense que c'est une vraie, une importante réunion pour la Société d'histoire historique du Canada. C'est une culmination de 2 ans de conversation, de recherche à l'intérieur de notre société, qui a commencé avec le manifesto de Precarious Instructors, qui était un moment important, je pense. The Precarious Instructors Manifesto, I think, was published about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, which really challenged the discipline to do better and to acknowledge structural inequality, structural violence within the discipline, and to sort of rethink some of the things that we do things and to think about these structures. The CHA responded to that precarious manifesto with its own report in 2021 with a set of recommendations. The report acknowledged, the deficiencies of sort of this meritocratic idea of, who gets a job and who doesn't and so on. And one of the recommendations was to create a task force, right, to really drill down and investigate the issue of the PhD program. There are concerns, there are concerns about, the ethics of our PhD programs in the context of, of a job market that is minimal, but also an opportunity maybe to rethink the PhD and what it does and what it can do, and to sort of open up a space, I think, for us to sort of think about our work in the departments more globally. And so this task force, chaired by Catherine Carstairs, they were already introduced by Antoine, has been working tremendously hard. And the report that you're going to be able to see and read in the coming days, you'll get a link for it today, is really, an original piece of research, right, that actually puts things into context. The executive and council met over the weekend, and we had a chance to read the report. And so we've already adopted past the recommendations that are directed towards the CHA in terms of going forward. So I just thank you for being here, I guess. Je vous remercie vraiment d'être ici aujourd'hui. Oui, donc Catherine, si vous voulez commencer, on peut commencer. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Steve. So thanks to everyone for coming to this webinar. For more than a year, this task force has been hard at work. And as chair, I have to say it's been an enormous pleasure to work with all of them. So vous allez entendre tous aujourd'hui, sauf Martin Pickett, qui avait un autre engagement. Mais je voulais commencer par un immense merci à tous le comité. Some of you heard our preliminary findings at the CHA meeting last May. Notre rapport complet est affiché par la Société historique du Canada. Tu peux trouver le lien dans le chat. Aujourd'hui, nous vous donnerons un aperçu du travail que nous avons effectué et de certaines recommandations que nous formulons. Will Langford will be speaking first about some of the research that the committee did and the issue of time to completion. And I have to give a huge thanks here to Will for all of the research that he did on this report. It was really spectacular. I'll address the financial strains of being a graduate student. Tina Liu and Christine Obamaswan will speak about the first 2 years of the PhD program, including co-op and qualifying exams. John Walsh will speak about the dissertation. And finally, Sam Hossack will address the issue of learning outcomes throughout our report. There were a number of concerns that are threaded through the entire report, and I just wanted to draw attention to those before we get into some of the details. One, of course, as Steve mentioned, is the current very bleak academic job market. We're not going to talk very much about that today, but there's a lot about that in the report itself. We really wanted to talk about, the past 20 years has seen some tremendous changes in how we're doing historical research. It's become much more interdisciplinary, much more community driven. We're also disseminating research in new ways. And we wanted our report to reflect how those changes in how we're doing history could be reflected in the training of the PhD program itself. We thought a lot about the lack of funding and the associated, I would argue, time to completion issues of many people taking longer than the period of funding to complete. And then another issue we wanted to really address throughout the report is the ways in which many of our colonial past is sort of written into how we do PhD training. So we wanted to reflect the changes that are taking place in terms of indigenizing and decolonizing our institution, and to think about how that might impact PhD training. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Will Langford.
Thanks, Catherine. If you've done a PhD, or maybe you're doing one now, one way to think about the PhD program is a cohort. Who was in your cohort? How many? What were they like? What did they study? How long did it take them to finish, if they finished at all? And where are they now? And I certainly think about my cohort at Queen's. It was 8 of us. One person dropped out within a few weeks. A couple people haven't finished, might not. There were 4 of us who got done in about 5 years, and one who was working in their 2nd, 3rd, and 4th language who took much longer, but that's completely understandable. And of the 8 of us, there's only 2 of us still in academia, and neither of us has a tenure track position. I think departments have those stories, you have those stories, we have those stories. But when we were first talking a year ago now, we kept having little side comments like, I wish we knew that, or I wonder if we could find out this, to get beyond the anecdote to the numbers. And with myself sometimes taking the lead, but I'll push back to Catherine a little bit. I think everyone else has followed and contributed original research. We tried to gather and count things. And so we're not merely lecturing departments or individuals on what should be done. We're hoping to provide a level of description and analysis that will be useful to you. So we did surveys and consultations. We looked into the program requirements at each university. 26 universities have offer PhD degrees incorporated into 24 programs. We looked at what these universities were promising for funding. We looked into the ins and outs of TA contracts and tuitions and fees, pulled stuff from Stats Canada, got federal and provincial scholarship figures, the actual results of the competitions, looked into tenure track hirings, and also where faculty got their PhDs. So I'm leaving all of that aside for the report and for my colleagues to discuss in a little bit, but I want to talk about completed dissertations. So that's my focus as we go to the next slide. For reasons that the report will discuss, it's often difficult to get a clear sense of how many people withdraw from PhD programs. We kind of have a sense of overall enrollment and who finishes. Withdrawal rate is more difficult to get at, but we can look at who finished and what they were doing, and that's because it's now standard to submit your dissertation to an online thesis repository. So that's where I went. Our sample is 6 years, September 2016 to August 2022. We're going to do 5 years, but then our work took a year, so we added another one. And I found 562 completed dissertations, 460 in English, 102 in French, and more men than women. Stats Canada's numbers on enrollment, I think in 2018, it was in history, PhD programs, it was 54% men, roughly 46% women. It's hard to do, or you can't conclusively do any kind of name, gender associations, but it seems that trend at least holds true for completed dissertations. Next. Okay, by year, we're talking roughly 100 dissertations by academic year, but you see the impact of COVID already, and we expect this to continue. There's been a real collapse in completions over the last 2 years. There's also been a kind of cresting downward of enrollments over this period. So I think we would expect to see a cresting downward of completions too, but clearly COVID hasn't had an impact. So the kind of rough rule of 100 completions that at the start of this period no longer holds true. Next, on a organisé les mêmes données par université et on voit l'université de Toronto, bon, c'est grand. University of Toronto has more than twice as many completions as anywhere else. I like this table because if you're thinking about your own department, you can kind of spot the comparative framework. Big programs are ones that have 30 to 40 graduates. There's this cluster around 20, and there's a bunch of programs who have 11 or fewer graduates over the last 6 years. So they're the kind of small programs. On the next slide. All right, so since I had the title of dissertations, and if I needed it, I had the abstracts, we were able to sort these in a number of ways by time period, by history subfield, and by geography. So here we go, temporal scope, huge emphasis towards the 20th century, but I think this is 58% of dissertations. But Tina looked into faculty and found this is roughly what it's like for faculty in departments. So this is kind of reflective of the profession in general. Next. All right, so Christine did an alternate sorting of this geographical information to try to reflect people who are doing Indigenous history focused on Indigenous territories, but I'll give you the normal containers in this slide. Canada's leading the way, but that's less than half dissertations. If I'm remembering correctly, I think that's 45% of dissertations focused on Canadian claimed Indigenous territories. There are a large number of people doing dissertations on Europe and the United States. We were able to take this information and compare it to the job market. And so there's a table in the report which may open some eyes about these geographical specializations and why people may want to think about what their geographic specializations are in terms of going to universities in Canada. But that information is provided to you. And in terms of field, I know many dissertations contribute to multiple fields. The goal here was to identify primary field. And you can see it's pretty well spread. Social history is there, but no other field is larger than 20% share. And we do see here, one thing that jumps out is that, military history, diplomatic histories, which I've grouped together, still interest a good many students. All right, so by going to online thesis repositories, I had when everybody finished, right? And so if I wanted to do time to completion, I just needed to know when people started. And I floundered a little bit here. I'll apologize to graduate secretaries and grad directors if I was bugging you. I was asking for information on students. In some provinces, that raises privacy issues. But what I belatedly figured out is that if I just Googled people, all I needed was a LinkedIn account or even a CV. It didn't even have to be a current CV. It could have been some internet artifact, but as long as someone, when they were in academia, said when they started their PhD, I got the information I wanted. And so I was able to find case-specific completion times for 355 people. And here is the chart, number of people completing at the various the time elapsed in their degree. One thing that's interesting here is you see the big spikes at the end of years, academic years. So the end of a funding period, for instance, where people are just making the deadline or just missing it. So big spike at year 4, 5, 6, 7, right? So this shows things elapsing, and the median completion time for these dissertations was 6 years, 1 month. But if we go to the next slide, I think this is even better. This is the same information, but it's presented as a cumulative percentage of PhDs completed over time. And what's revealing about this is if we click next, I'll bring in some little triangles. All right, so if you see in the lower left, my triangle is at 4 years. 5% of completed dissertations happened by the 4-year mark. If we go forward to 5 years, it was right just around 25% of dissertations were completed by year 5. And when Catherine talks about funding, and I'm sure many of you know, these are important markers. If you look at the other side, my last triangle is at 7 years. And by 7 years, low 60% of people who are going to finish had finished. And so that means over a third of people are taking 7 years or longer. And there's this long tail on this graph that goes out to 14 years. And because it's taking a lot of people longer to finish their degrees, it's dragging out the average. So the median is when 50% of people had finished. That's at 6 years, 1 month. But the average, the mean completion time for a dissertation in Canada, 6 years, 7 months, taking a long time. All right. The other thing that Googling hopefully let us get at as best as possible is what happened to people after they finished their degree. And so I like this one because many people who are doing a dissertation, not all, aspire to an ongoing academic research position. Well, I was able to look at people's CVs and figure out kind of what happens when you finish. 23 people got an immediate tenure track job. 108 had some sort of postdoc on their record. But for 431 people, that no postdoc, right? So you finish your degree, you're done. There isn't that kind of next step that you might assume people need to figure out what they're doing for work immediately. And that's what one of the appendix does. My last slide here, as best as possible using Google searches and LinkedIn accounts and whatever else I could find. I tried to find current job information on people and then categorize them. There's a big unknown here in gray. 162 people we don't know about, but we got rough information or good information on 400 people. And this is something to study, I think, in your own time. But what I do like about it is in deep blue and lighter blue, it's the university or post-secondary education sector. So recent PhD graduates are largely being retained in the university sector, but where they're being retained is a different story. If you see here, there's 58 tenure track professors in the sample. That not all of them work in Canada too. They're only a portion of those people work in Canada, but there's more sessional instructors than there are tenure track professors. And there's all sorts of people in kind of research and support roles. So university sector, but the details are another story. So I encourage you to see that. And that's, our attempt to scale up beyond the anecdote, beyond the cohort, and get a sense of what's going on among those people who succeeded in graduating in the last 6 years.
So thank you so much, Will. I'm going to start this section about funding, about talking about an imaginary student at U of T. We've picked on U of T here, and we do in the report as well, partly because, as Will has outlined, they have the largest graduate program in Canada. I'm also a U of T graduate myself, so when we think back to our cohorts, I think of U of T. And U of T also now provides, quite a generous funding, guaranteed funding package to their students. And yet, as I'll outline, it still has students living well below the poverty line. So the guaranteed funding is $27,000 a year, which sounds good at first, but of course, students need to pay over $6,000 of tuition out of this $27,000. They need to pay almost $2,000 in ancillary fees. And then the estimated rent in Toronto is somewhere between $12,000 a year and $32,000 a year. I think $12,000 is the estimate provided by Toronto Student Life, and it's assuming people are living in a house with shared rooms and that kind of thing, or having a shared room in a house. I suspect most people would be pretty hard pressed to find housing in Toronto for $12,000 a year at this point, and that the circumstances under which you were living might not be ideal to actually focusing on your PhD program if you were paying that little in terms of rent. And then the cost of living in Toronto is roughly $15,000 a year, not including rent. So that means that, even living with the sort of bottom rent you could potentially pay, which, I think is a little imaginary in any case, the expenses exceed the guaranteed funding package by almost $9,000 a year. So this imaginary student is going into debt even during their periods of funding, never mind the period of time after people complete their guaranteed funding period. So we're asking students to live in poverty. And I think that that has real bearings on who feels like they can afford to enter a PhD program. So if you have family support or savings, then doing a PhD might seem a lot more feasible than if you're a student who doesn't have access to those resources. And I think that really impacts on diversity in our profession today. And U of T is not alone. We've picked on U of T because it's large, but this is a graph that we'll put together, and you can see what the guaranteed minimum funding is at every institution, but he's taken out all that students pay in terms of tuition and fees. So you can see that none of the funding packages, once you subtract tuition and fees, accounts to more than $20,000 a year. The line at the top of the graph is the market basket measure, which is what we use now as Canada's poverty line. So you can see at every single school in the country, what students are getting in terms of a guaranteed funding package is less than the cost of living in that city, or it requires you living below the poverty line. An additional thing for this is we're sort of assuming in this material that someone's single, doesn't have dependents, but we know in fact that PhD students as a whole are not as young as maybe professors would like to think they are. So as you can see from this graph, this is humanities doctoral graduates. Stats Canada doesn't break it down by history grads. But that 70% of doctoral graduates are in their 30s. So they might have started it in their 20s, but they're finishing in their 30s. And by this point, many people have dependents, whether that be children or aging parents. And so, these cost of living estimates, which we put together basically on a single person, doesn't apply to actually many of our students who have other kinds of financial obligations. The other issue that we looked into and then we detailed into the report is, how many people are able to get those lucrative external scholarships? Because certainly we know that students who get access to a CGS doctoral fellowship are, doing much better than the guaranteed minimum funding. But what this chart shows is that, really relatively few students are getting access to these awards. There's just not that many of them. So, 32 students in history were awarded a CGS in 2021. There's the Shirk Doctoral Fellowship, which is $20,000 a year, but we know that often some of that gets clawed back by departments and is replacing the existing funding package. So, it's not always as lucrative as it looks. And so there's sort of two issues here. One is I think we really would like to see, and we've asked the CHA to advocate for an increase not only in the amount of these fellowships, but that there be more fellowships available. But we're also conscious of the fact that this often creates two tiers of graduate students as well, those who have access to these more lucrative external fellowships, and then those who are reliant on departmental funding. And that has real issues in terms of equity amongst our graduate students, which is part of the reason why we'd like to see more of these awards exist to try and diminish some of those inequalities. So yeah, as you can see, we're basically forcing our PhD students to live in very difficult financial circumstances, and I think the material realities of this, underline what the PhD experience has become. So with that, I will turn it over to Tina.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to talk about the first roughly 2 years of students' programs, and I'm going to focus on coursework. And Christine's going to talk about qualifying or comprehensive exams. So let's get started. We want to recognize, and we do in the report, that there are departments are undertaking changes to their programs in response to the time to completion issue. And those changes basically are aimed, as the slide says, at really facilitating dissertation research and writing, and improving that time to completion. So you see common things departments are doing, requiring fewer courses, fewer required courses, trying to streamline programs so there's a closer relationship between a student's coursework and what they're working on. For instance, a lot of writing seminars. Some are doing things trying to prepare students for more than their dissertation research. There are lots of professional development courses out there aimed at helping students write CVs, write grants, tips on applying for jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And we have some things to say about those professional development courses in the report. And there's a huge literature on different approaches to professional development that we can talk about in the Q&A. Those changes are super important and they have had an effect on time to completion, but I think the committee all agreed that we need more reform. And that reform really starts with some questioning of the assumptions that underlie the content of coursework. So are we really only training graduate students, doctoral students, for tenure track jobs? And given the bleak job market, is this really a good thing? Should we be thinking about changing the content of coursework? We also need, and this we heard from webinar participants, we need to think about translating the skills that students we're teaching and students are learning in our graduate courses into a language that makes sense to us, but makes sense in other professional contexts. So we're actually doing more than we think we are. We just don't know it. So we need to think about things like, what are we doing when we teach or learn historiography? Or, you know, it's not just a literature review. What else is going on that, that we can translate into a language of skills that would make sense to us, would still have integrity to us, but also make sense to people who are hiring in non-academic job contexts. And we heard a lot about this, we need to facilitate and support students to develop skills in other courses in other contexts, ones that would facilitate the research and position them well for other professional careers. So we heard about the need for quantitative skills. So statistics would be a good thing for students to learn, for instance. But we're also thinking about things like GIS, any digital skills, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that we've learned about as a committee is something called work integrated learning, WIL. And maybe that's a way to do this. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So this is a definition. It's taken from the Cooperative Education and Work Integrated Learning group in Canada. So work integrated learning, broadly speaking, it's experiential education that formally integrates academic studies. So we're not jettisoning academic studies with experiences within a workplace or a practice setting. So I'm going to focus on one kind of work integrated learning. There are 9 different kinds. I'm going to talk about co-op, PhD co-op, which is offered at some institutions across the country. I think we identified 3, but it's really hard to know. Students, these programs vary, but what you see on the screen are some of the common aspects. And I won't read what's on the screen, but when I say that students get support from co-op staff, that support, well, here at UBC, where we do have PhD co-op, includes pre-employment training on resumes, non-academic cover letters, those sorts of things, how to do interviews, a mock interview. They're also supported when they are working. There are co-op site visits. And they get, in the end, a notation on their transcript. So it is coursework, but the support that students get and the transcript notation, the qualification, is really what makes PhD co-op different, say, from an internship. It's not for everybody. It's not for people who are close to finishing or for people who don't have a degree of flexibility in their timetables or their work interests. But where it works, it really works. And I'm going to give you an example. So meet Henry John, a doctoral student who I'm fortunate enough to be working with. Henry's from the UK, so he's an international student. So international students are eligible for co-op. He's an environmental historian, and he's working on a topic, BC's war in the woods, the fights over old growth logging that are still going on today. He did 3 co-op terms at the Catsa Station Museum and Archives, which is on Vancouver Island. And what they wanted done was organizing their some 300 boxes of material from a union, from the International Woodworkers of America papers. So that's what Henry was spending his co-op term doing. It's related to his thesis. So I'm telling you this for a reason. The Lake Cowichan, where this museum and archives is located, is a logging town, and it's very proud of its history. And the museum is very much a settler museum, one devoted to this place's role in the forestry industry. So he did it. Over the course of a year, he organized this material. He wrote finding aids for it. He didn't have any archival training. He did some online courses to give him a foundation, and he was supported by UBC archivists. He's written about this about these collections for Labor Le Travail. So he's gotten a peer-reviewed publication out of this. It's coming out in the winter issue. It's been a super interesting journey for him, I think both personally and intellectually, and in ways I think that speak to the potentially transformative power of co-op to shape knowledge production, to forge ties between the university and community, and fundamentally to transform relationships. I say it's been an interesting journey because he came to UBC as an environmental activist. Before he came to the graduate program, he was on the front lines of a lot of protests about pipelines, logging old growth, that he's been an ally in Indigenous land defense actions. And all that experience really shaped his dissertation topic. But he's always been interested in, I guess, what we would think of as the other side, in the forestry companies and workers. And the co-op placement he saw as a chance to kind of do that. But doing that really required relationship building, overcoming suspicions about who he was and what his motives were. And it required learning on his part, overcoming the assumptions that he had about resource workers and resource communities. So it was about building networks and relationships. It was all about trust and relationship building, and it's transformed his dissertation. And here's this is a quote from something that he's actually written. He lives in Lake Cowichan, and over time, he thinks he's achieved this status as an insider, and it's really fundamentally changed the shape of his dissertation. And I would say that it's also changed him. It's complicated his understanding of these conflicts in the woods. In a piece that he wrote for Inside Higher Education about his experience, he makes the point that I think we all should remember. He makes the point that we should remember that scholarly work occurs in different places. So he says, I didn't stop being a history PhD student when he at the museum is chatting with that former logger about the development of the chainsaw, even though I'm on the clock while we talk. And here's the point I think, at least I took away from this, and I hope you will too. It's time to stop framing career conversations as separate from the work we do as scholars. Okay, that I think is key. And he goes on to talk about the benefits of co-op, but it's really that bit in red that I think is an important takeaway point. Henry's gone on to show that the learning actually goes both ways. He's certainly learned from the people at the Catsa Station Museum, as in ways I've just talked about, but they've also learned from him. He's, as I said, had long-standing relationships with other communities, communities of environmentalists, communities of Indigenous activists. And with his help and guidance, the museum has really changed its exhibits to be more inclusive and in ways that acknowledge the Indigenous nations on whose territories the museum sits. And one of his proudest achievements, I think, is helping the museum forge a protocol with the local First Nation that Flat Lake Cowichan, the town, is located in. And this has led to this, what I've got on the screen here, the successful funding application for a gathering place. And it's one that is constructed both by the local loggers who are doing the benches and part of the supporting infrastructure for the site, and an Indigenous carver. So I think co-op is really doing more than keeping students from getting deeper in debt. In this case, co-op facilitated collaborative knowledge creation and knowledge mobilization. It brought together different knowledge holders and experts in productive ways. Productive ways that, among other things, fulfill the university's mission as a public institution. And the last thing I'll say is, I'm sure you're wondering if work integrated learning and co-op can extend students' programs, right? I mean, since this all started with the issue of time to completion. Sometimes it does, but it again provides them with paid work. But it doesn't necessarily lengthen it either. And as to Henry, he's just at year 6, and I've just got a completed full first draft as his dissertation, and he will finish this academic year. So this is a success story, and I hope that you come away from this story with a sense of what work integrated learning and specifically co-op can do, and how it's not something that's really separate from our academic, the academic training that our programs give students. And with that, I'll turn it over to Christine.
Kwai, greetings from unceded Wasanic territory. So I'm going to cover also in the category of the first 2 years, looking at the comprehensive or qualifying exams. In most programs across the country, doctoral students are expected to complete their comprehensive exams by the end of their 2nd year. Through our information gathering, we confirmed that in doctoral history programs throughout the country, the comprehensive examination requirement commences at the end of year 1, spans all of year 2, and may transcend into the first few months of year 3. While the timeline for comprehensive exam completion is relatively standard across the country, there's growing variation among programs as to the comprehensive examination structure, noticeably distinctions in the numbers of fields and books required. This suggests to us that the relevancy of comprehensive exams in history PhD programs across the country is perhaps the most contentious issue that we might be grappling with in our programs. Views about comprehensive exams were divided as reflected in results from our survey. 21% of respondents thought no modification to comprehensive exams were required. 27% of English respondents and 28% of French respondents supported replacing one or more comprehensive examination fields with the opportunity to teach a course, and 28% of English respondents and 30% of French respondents supported replacing one or more comprehensive examination fields with a co-op internship. When speaking about the importance and relevancy of comprehensive exams, we are all familiar with references to subject mastery, subject knowledge, and command of the field. It is often recognized that comprehensive exams allow students to demonstrate their knowledge in the field, interrogate and integrate concepts, principles, and theories, and display the required knowledge to undertake and complete future research and/or teaching assignments. There are undoubtedly strong rationales for supporting the continuance of comprehensive examinations across the discipline. Yet, as I already alluded to, there's also growing skepticism across the discipline and in our programs about the relevancy of comprehensive exams moving forward. This brings me to some of the arguments against the continuance of comprehensive exams moving forward. In our survey, we received feedback where respondents probed whether it is possible to comprehensively master a field. Another respondent declared the process brutal, while another labeled it to be a form of academic hazing. Reference to hazing struck a chord with me because, in my mind, it named my own experiences as a doctoral student, as an Indigenous graduate student, as well as the experiences of doctoral students that I have supported as a faculty member over the last 15 years or so. Sadly, some of these students have come my way in response to what we might see as a kind of academic hazing, most often as it relates to comprehensive exam expectations. Truth be told, they often come from other departmental homes. Searches. Many of these students are searching for an Indigenous scholar, any Indigenous scholar, sometimes regardless of discipline, to support and mentor them through these sometimes diminishing and even hostile processes. And I'm sure there's examples where our history PhD students, specifically Indigenous, racialized, and marginalized students, have sought refuge outside our history departments and discipline because of the types of academic hazing they might be experiencing, particularly through comprehensive examination processes. And so we thought in this presentation we would draw on stories and examples. And I didn't want to highlight, I decided not to highlight one of the examples just because it isn't such a feel-good story, and I don't want to expose the student in terms of who I was speaking to the group with. So I want to highlight, I'm a sport historian. I couldn't resist the opportunity to draw on a sports analogy, and recognize that when we think about hazing, we most often probably think about sporting contexts. So to better understand hazing in sports, I want to draw from the work of sports psychologist Chris Stankovich, who in his article titled "The Direct and Subtle Dangers of Sport Hazing" explains, quote, "Hazing in sports occurs when current team members require a new player to go through various physical and/or emotional tasks in order to be accepted by the team. In some instances, the potential harm is easily visible, like we can see in the picture on this screen. Less obvious emotional harms occur when new players are forced into embarrassing and humiliating situations, like having to walk around the school wearing self-deprecating message. Regardless of whether an individual experiences physical or emotional distress through hazing, the pain and suffering is real and can lead to devastating consequences," end quote. And so while we can't make direct correlations between hazing in sports and academia, we can make subtle associations. And so I want to draw on the groupthink phenomenon. Again, it comes from, it's used often in sports psychology, but it is a phenomenon that we might think to use here. As psychologists have affirmed, there's a direct correlation between hazing, generally speaking, inside and outside sporting contexts, and the groupthink psychological phenomenon. I want us to think for a minute about the groupthink phenomenon and what might occur within a group when there is a desire for harmony or conformity, which are usually entrenched in groups, culture and in group culture and expectation, premised on persuasive personalities, and dependent on cooperating members who feel they are expected to participate. Taking this one step further, we might think of ourselves within the groupthink phenomenon, whether as a broad community of historians or smaller collectives in our separate university departments, and consider to what extent is there a desire for harmony or conformity in our discipline and throughout our departments. We might further interrogate to what extent there exists an entrenched group culture expectations that demarcates our disciplinary standards, how these expectations might be premised on persuasive personalities those established scholars, as well as scholarship that has stood the test of time, and how our groupthink mentality is dependent on members who feel they are expected to participate, our PhD students. We might take this last point one step further to suggest that our students are not only cooperating members who feel they are expected to participate, but rather our students are obliged members who are required to participate. And because there's a growing uncertainty about the comprehensive examinations, I think this is an important point for consideration. Whether we are for or against the continuance of comprehensive exams, there are important considerations moving forward. Our report speaks specifically to questions of time to completion, as well as funding and financial burdens. These are important questions that need to be weighed when taking into account that many programs are merging these exams with coursework and/or dissertation requirements. And one notable history department has abandoned comprehensive exams altogether. We know that it is taking our PhD students significantly longer to complete their degrees than funding packages guarantee. So taking a long, hard look at the intent, relevancy, and procedures for comprehensive exams is necessary. And naturally, there are pedagogical questions as to whether examinations are the best way to evaluate student learning. And of course, we must question what we are preparing doctoral students for. As we know, tenure stream positions in history are sparse. There is a demand for more teaching professors and instructors, and an increasing number of our graduates are moving into the non-academic market. So we must ask, what are we preparing our students for? Further, there are questions about how our students are trained, recognizing an increasing demand for interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and transdisciplinary studies. These demands are coming from our increasingly diverse student body, as well as external funding bodies, such as SSHRC. With that said, we need to think about how requirements and comprehensive exam processes reflect colonial practices and act as a barrier to recruiting and nurturing a more diverse group of students. We must question what kinds of scholarship appear on qualifying exam lists, including works saturated in colonial and racist thought. Finally, we must ask how community may participate in such processes, particularly for those PhD students who have strong ties to community, as well as those aspiring to engage in community-centered and community-driven scholarship and scholarly endeavors. I close with an image, and of course, again, drawing in a sporting context. This image might inspire us to consider the comprehensive examination process, or a possible substitute, not as a site for potential academic hazing, isolation, and solitude, and one that operates unilaterally, but rather as nurturing, diverse, and potentially community-centered spaces, as one that is premised on the giving and receiving of knowledge and teachings. Uliuni Haichka, thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Welcome from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I hope that in what I'm going to say about the dissertation specifically, you're going to hear echoes, especially in what we just heard from Christine, as well as Tina a little bit earlier. And what I'm going to do today is do a sort of greatest hits from not just the report, but even the slides. And so the slides are going to have a little bit more in terms of the breadth of some of the recommendations and concerns pursued in the report, but I'm just going to tease out some of those. And like Tina, I'm going to share a story to kind of illustrate more anecdotally one of the ways that we could perhaps reimagine the dissertation. So the dissertation, of course, is the capstone of every PhD student. And in fact, listening again to Tina and Christine talk today, I'm reminded about the kind of emphasis in the report of thinking about the dissertation and its relationship to those first 2 years. That the comp exam or the comp process of the dissertation proposal shouldn't be this line of demarcation that black box is all that came before, but that as we're thinking about the future of the PhD, we can think more about how to better integrate from the first day into the program to the last day when we get to celebrate their walks across the stage and beyond. And in the report, and today I want to begin by identifying something that's at the heart of how our departmental websites, and this goes from British Columbia to Newfoundland, define the dissertation for prospective PhD students who we should assume are the ones coming to our websites looking for information about our programs. It says that the dissertation needs to be an original contribution to historiography or to historical knowledge. But websites don't explain what original means, and they assume that the reader understands this. And our report suggests that in the context of a wider set of changes in structures, practices, and learning objectives and outcomes for the PhD in history, there's both opportunity and obligation for programs to think more ambitiously, more creatively, and we think responsibly about the dissertation as both a thing, but also, again, as a process. And boy, listening to Christine talk about hazing and that notion of struggle and suffering as, and the ways that we need to find just a whole different language with which to think about all of this stuff. But until now, the most identifiable form of change brought to the dissertation in history departments is, of course, a reduction in page counts. Shorter dissertations, the thinking seems to have been, will shrink that time to completion and thus lower the burden, the financial burden on our students. And this is, of course, a good thing. But page counts, our report suggests, are only a start. Our research shows that time to completion is only one of a myriad of factors that undermine students' success, satisfaction, and wellness. And so those of us in positions to shape programs have an obligation to do better by them. And one of the ways that we argue for in the report is by creating more pathways for students to reach the same core learning objectives and outcomes for the dissertation. Indeed, 75% of our Qualtrics survey respondents agree with this, that the dissertation is in need of some form of reform beyond page counts, although shorter page counts was one of the things that they favored. Research projects defined as community engaged or community based are required to be reflexive about the ethics, the politics, and epistemological dimensions involved. Researchers, of course, have to negotiate and facilitate relationships with others who may or may not have much experience with scholarly academic knowledge production and storytelling. Now, of course, not all, in fact, maybe even a minority of projects are community-based. But the report argues that all history PhD dissertation processes can and ought to integrate some form of community engagement. And the report gets into this in some detail and explains that it doesn't have to be things that are outside what is already being done in some respects. It's about reframing it and about valuing it a little bit differently. Because our research has demonstrated to us, and the webinars on employment were particularly important here, but our research demonstrates that these kinds of skills are essential for post-degree careers, not only in academia, as Christine pointed out, but also in the private and public sectors. And again, the report goes into some more detail about how engagement in particular can be integrated into the dissertation process without extending, again, the time to completion. In 2015, which seems like a lifetime ago with the pandemic, Timothy Guilfoyle told his fellow members of the American Historical Association that there was already by then a wide gulf in how tenured professors like himself were disseminating their research and how doctoral students were able to do so. And we agree, and in fact we argue that by 2022 this gulf is getting even wider. And the report considers some ways for how dissertation forms can be reconsidered to better align the content of the doctoral student research, the goals that the student has for this research and for themselves after the degree, and in alignment with the final form the dissertation might take. And this could include such things as portfolios, public history elements, but also engaging more fully with digital humanities to explore how scholarly research can get beyond utilizing these tools to extract data from archives and more fully deploy them to mobilize knowledge. Crystal Gale Fraser and Alyssa Stevenson's recent essay in the Canadian Historical Review points and reminds us and urges us to consider fundamentally the importance for structural change in history departments and programs to accompany the cultural change that is occurring slowly and unevenly across universities and other professional and cultural workspaces. And in the context of the dissertation, one of the ways that we might think about this is how we currently configure advisory and examination committees. Who is defined as a qualified expert and on what criteria by our departments, our universities, and our profession? On what basis is originality defined and evaluated? For whom is knowledge produced? And while such questions are essential for students and projects that are either being produced by Indigenous scholars or about Indigenous peoples and cultures and territories, they are no less critical for all history programs and doctoral students to be trained to answer. Reconsidering the possibilities for dissertation committees is one area among many where the CHA, we think, has a role to help promote and normalize across the profession. Good intentions are not enough. structural change in the dissertation process built around student success and training and engage more consistently and fully with the publics who make our research possible is needed. So, like Tina, this is proud supervisor alert. But here, this is Rick Duthie. He's a recent graduate of Carleton's History PhD program. And as the title that you see here on the slide suggests, Rick produced a dissertation that speaks to some of the proposed reforms in the report, and I hope in some of my remarks already today. Rick came to Carleton in 2015 with not only a BA and an MA in history, but also with professional training and experience as a stage actor and playwright. He knew he wanted to do a dissertation involving the history of labor relations in Sudbury, and perhaps build upon his MA work that had focused on the role of theater in union life in the 1940s local in the city. My colleague David Dean, who among many things has been the historical advisor to a number of plays at the National Arts Center in Ottawa, and myself as co-supervisors, we sat down with Rick in the early days of his degree to dream with him about how his two professional selves, the actor playwright and the labor historian, could be reconciled in a PhD project. We were fortunate enough to have Dr. Yana Mirzon from the University of Ottawa's Department of Theatre as part of this process, and she played a vital role on Rick's advisory committee and in fact doing some of the coursework with Rick in his training. A little less after 4 years than Rick arrived, after extensive archival research into labor relations and a wide range of oral history interviews with women and men who had lived through this series of strikes and job actions in Sudbury from the late 1950s to the recent past, David and I found ourselves hot, sweaty, a little uncomfortable, but very excited to be sitting in the Ukrainian National Federation Hall in Sudbury to take in one of the 6 live performances of a play written and directed by Rick called One Day Stronger. As these photographs hint at, the play was staged so that the audience was up close to the actors on either side of them. Historical photographs were projected on a screen, and extracts from the oral interviews as well as other historical sounds created a sort of multimedia scape that worked in concert with the two actors, who played a number of roles across generations of the Sudbury family and the city itself. And after the play, the audience was invited to stay back, enjoy some snacks, and engage into a question and answer with both Rick and the actors. And this was a particularly fascinating process for us as supervisors, especially to observe. Because within each audience, and each audience was somewhere between 40 and 50 people, it included a wide range of people, people who had direct connections to the job actions being depicted here in the plays, but others who were just residents of the city. Some were newcomers to the city and wanted to understand the place a little better. But also in the audience were all the people who had sat down for interviews with Rick and whose stories and whose memories had been integrated into the development of the fictional characters on stage set into these historically factual settings and circumstances. And if you just Google One Day Stronger and Vimeo, you can see the play for yourself as Rick has made it available. So the table of contents that you can see on the left here, when you look at that, you can see how the dissertation's interest in testing how effective live theater can be as a form of public labor history, but also in exploring the gendered experience and memories of job actions and strikes in mining towns like Sudbury, were woven together in a series of chapters that use the play's making as a narrative structure for the dissertation as a whole. And I've included this extract from Rick's conclusion, but it's really just the last 2 sentences that I want to highlight here. Moreover, he writes, the scripting and staging of these memories within the familial setting enabled audience members to talk about their own experiences as part of a scholarly and commemorative public forum. This act of sharing was cathartic throughout the process for participants, including individuals who chose not to speak publicly and instead preferred to participate via social media, email, or through written comments. And this included direct messaging that both David and I received from people who were involved with the project, but who just felt nervous about speaking up at the public forum. Rick never wanted to do work only about these mining families, their experiences and their memories. He wanted to work with them to better understand their knowledge of the past and how it compared and contrasted with other ways of knowing these histories. And I urge you to watch the play and read the dissertation to appreciate just how well the dissertation process and form were able to accomplish just that. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Sam.
Thanks, John. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to wrap up our presentation now with a discussion on learning outcomes, which are really a way for us, I think, to reflect some of the overall findings and recommendations of the report, but also a way for us to think about a way forward for the PhD programs in history. And when we think about learning outcomes, often we think about, undergraduate classes when we're either teaching them or taking them and sort of what we're supposed to get out of them. But I'd encourage us to think about these as sort of program level learning outcomes and thinking not just about what the minutiae are, but those basic principles and how we can take those basic questions of what are the goals of the program and how are those goals actually achieved, to really think about the programs that we're putting together, that we're revising, and keeping those questions at the front of our minds. I want to start with a couple of vignettes that are based on real actual people that are grad students, but I'm not naming them so that I don't out them accidentally. But this is the first student, who I will call Remy. And Remy is a sort of first, second, early career PhD student who's trying to prepare for candidacy, trying to look forward to their proposal. They haven't written a test in over 3 years. They've written some different proposals for SSHRC and other grant competitions, had some mixed success, still struggling with some of those funding questions. But really the thing that's causing them the most stress and anxiety right now is that they know that they have these 2 major milestones coming up in their program. They know these are pass-fail milestones. Their continuation as PhD students is contingent on passing, but they don't know what passing means. What are the criteria for passing the comprehensive exam? What are the criteria for passing a dissertation proposal? They've been told over and over again over the last year to just read everything you can, enjoy the process of reading. It's the only time in your career where all you do is read. But reading is an activity. It's not the assessment itself. Remy doesn't know if they need to demonstrate knowledge of methodologies, of content. Do they need to be able to have a philosophical conversation about liberal order framework, or just sort of explain what it is and sort of why it matters? Is that one book that was referenced that one time in a seminar going to be brought up, or are they going to be able to focus on just explaining trends in their field? On top of all of these questions is also this upcoming proposal due date. How long is that proposal going to be? Do they really need to explain what original research is at this point in the process? They haven't really started doing any of the actual research yet. So what does that even mean? Everyone says, don't worry, but last term someone had to leave the program because they failed candidacy. Is Remy going to be next? So those questions plague PhD students all throughout the first couple of years of the program. I passed candidacy a few years ago, but I can still feel that anxiety at this time of year. I know my program is just working through, they just had the written exams on Tuesday. I still feel the anxiety as I was sitting Tuesday morning in my office waiting for everyone to come back. And so those conditions, these questions create a lot of additional stress and dissatisfaction for PhD students. And we know that it's causing them a lot of emotional and mental harm as well. But the good news is these are all questions that can be addressed by having clearly communicated learning outcomes that provide answers to those questions that students are able to understand. Because I want to talk about a second part of this. And this is my second vignette, who I'm going to cheekily call Sam. Sam is coming to the end of their PhD program. They're just starting to finish the final chapters of their dissertation. They're beginning edits, but they're already having to start thinking about what comes next, starting to apply for post-graduation jobs. What's going to be the situation come next September? They're trying to put together a CV, write cover letters outlining their skills, but they're not really sure how to differentiate themselves from other candidates, or even themselves 5 years ago when they just finished their master's. Yeah, I know more about my dissertation topic, a lot more than I did when I began writing, but how do I actually apply those skills to the real world? Is all of this information that I've learned something that I can translate to a hiring committee or a hiring manager? Is it something that they're actually going to be interested in? And how do I show them that what I've done over the last 5 years actually matters and isn't just a job gap in my resume? When I write down all the activities I've done, it seems like I've grown a lot and improved my skills, but some of the things still feel like I had to jump through hoops to meet requirements. J'ai réussi cet examen de langue, mais je ne peux toujours pas parler bien français. So there's a lot of common concerns of PhD students that we discovered in putting together the report over the last year. There's this continual perception of hoop jumping through certain activities. There's huge mental and physical health strains due to the workload and the uncertainty. There's all of these questions all of the time for PhD students. And there's also a disconnect between the PhD skills and the career skills. And I know everyone on the committee has already talked a little bit today about what we're actually training PhD students for. And as you'll read in the report, hopefully soon, is that there are a set of skills that we have traditionally trained PhD students for, but those don't necessarily translate to skills that are required or being looked for by hiring managers outside of academia. Another major concern for PhD students is the discrepancies in requirements across universities. So if you look from university to university at what the requirements are for different programs, some programs require more activities and assessments than others. Some require fewer things. And some of those discrepancies also create some major concerns for PhD students about the value of their own degrees and about the way that they are going to be compared to colleagues that are getting their dissertations and PhDs completed through other universities. And PhD students talk to each other across different universities, so we know. So I'm going to bring in this alignment theory of program development, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before or thought about this as you're designing your courses for undergraduate, or you're thinking about these things, or maybe you've actually done this in terms of program development as well. But this is sort of the base theory of program development that suggests that you have these three pillars of programs. You have your learning outcomes, your activities, and your assessments. And all three of those things should align with each other, and they should all contribute to the goals of the program. Learning outcomes should be matched to the activities and to the assessments, and they should be clearly articulated. That's important for students who are going to be in the program or who are looking at coming into the program, but it's also really important for faculty so that they know what it is that they are supposed to be expecting of students, and they can help to communicate that to them as well. Also really useful for consistency. So on a smaller scale, we use the same type of alignment theory in course development, but it applies really well to programs and is something that I encourage you to think about as you're restructuring your own programs. Go to the next slide. So in terms of applying this to history PhDs, there are a strong list of required activities for completing PhDs, and there are some very clear assessments for every PhD program. Activities include things like coursework and candidacy, all of the other elements that go into candidacy outside of the exam, putting together a proposal, a dissertation, as well as activities that aren't necessarily milestones. So things like TAing or teaching, writing grant applications. Many programs require that you apply for SHRC until you eventually hopefully get it. So those are all activities that belong to the PhD program. Assessments are predominantly the comprehensive exam, which is pass-fail typically, as well as the dissertation defense, also typically pass-fail. Some programs also have language exams, which you can count as an assessment, but also has an activity component of actually learning the language and being able to pass that as well. So all of our programs have these components in some variation, but not all of these actually align with each other or with learning outcomes. These activities aren't necessarily mapping to specific assessments, so it's not clear whether or not students are actually getting the benefit out of doing those activities. And it's neither is it actually necessarily mapped to a clear learning outcome, to a clear goal of the program, which brings us to the question that many students have of, why am I doing this and what am I actually accomplishing here? And the same questions that faculty have: what are we doing? Why are students doing this? So in addition to this, there's also a lot of weight that is put onto the assessments, particularly the comprehensive exam and the dissertation defense. And that also pulls everything out of alignment because students feel this added pressure that's adding stress and burnout to their programs. And it makes the other activities feel less important. It really leads to that sense of hoop jumping. If there's not a clear assessment attached to something, why am I necessarily doing it? other than getting paid and maybe being able to bump myself up over the poverty line, what is the purpose of me doing all of this TAing or this required course teaching? And so those are also really important considerations to have when we're thinking about what the assessments are going to be for our programs, what the activities are going to be, and how all of those things contribute to the goals. So because the breaking of alignment is happening in programs, the outcomes of PhD programs ultimately end up being something along the lines of know and understand enough about your field and your research question without really helping students or faculty understand or know what either of those things mean. What does it actually mean to know something about your field of study? How do you measure that? How can you communicate that to a student who is trying to know these things about their field? And how are they to communicate that to a potential employer, whether that's someone in academia or not? So we all know, and I think we can all agree, that a PhD is much more than a comprehensive exam and a dissertation defense. It takes a lot to get to those assessments, but when the evaluation of those two major milestones is unclear, when the learning that goes into those assessments isn't well defined, and when the purpose and ultimate meaning of those things, it means that the purpose and ultimate meaning of the PhD in history is distorted. All right, so throughout the presentation and the report, which I'm hoping that you will all read very soon, we've made a number of recommendations about how to address some of these issues in history PhD programs. And as we move forward and continue this work in each of our own departments, we need to remember that at its core, program redesign means that we need to think about what the goals of the program are. There needs to be clear learning outcomes. We need to ensure that there's some alignment between what students are supposed to be learning and supposed to be developing as skills, and the activities that they need to complete and the assessments that they need to pass. All right, and just to conclude here, if we're able to create some of that alignment and to clearly articulate these skills and activities and learnings for students, we can address a lot of underlying student and supervisor and faculty stress. If we're able to articulate comprehensive exam as a culmination of coursework, and that reading widely actually demonstrates broad knowledge of methodological approaches in the field of history, and to show a deep and current specialist historical knowledge in a geographic, temporal, or thematic area, we can alleviate a lot of the stress of Remy. If we can answer Remy's questions of what is good enough by explaining that they need to be able to engage articulately in dialogue about historical knowledge and research with academic audiences, we can actually provide a set of goalposts that may not currently exist. If SAM knows that during their program, they actually learned to collaborate with others in the university context and beyond through, say, a panel presentation, they can easily translate that to a CV and a cover letter. If they know that they've been trained to appreciate the limitations of the field of history and demonstrate an awareness of other academic and cultural ways of knowing the past, they can more readily apply their skills and speak the language of employers, both academic and not academic. So ultimately, providing students and faculty with those clearer learning outcomes that address what the ultimate goals of a PhD program are can address a lot of the concerns that we as a committee have heard over the last year and that we've talked about in the report. So by aligning those activities and assessments with the learning outcomes and those goals, those perceived hoops can be given some meaning, and PhD programs can provide better demonstrated value to students, universities, and communities.
Thanks so much, Sam. So I'm going to walk us through the last little bit very, very quickly because I want to leave time for questions and responses. We do have a whole series of recommendations throughout the report, and they're embedded throughout the report. We haven't, sort of concluded at the end with this is what departments should do. And part of that is because we really appreciated that departments are responding to a lot of local circumstances, and they might have very different answers to some of these questions depending on the niches of their programs and the local needs and communities that they're serving. So I'm going to go over these recommendations very quickly because some of them have come up in the presentation itself. But we did want departments and supervisors to really make themselves aware of the bleak academic job market. I know that most people are, but Just how bad it is in the report. And as well as what the patterns are of hiring for students and the stress and anxiety that all of this causes for PhD students as they're going through their programs. As Sam has nicely outlined, we did encourage everyone to adopt learning outcomes for their program, and we have actually included in the report some model learning outcomes that departments can potentially work with. We also have quite a few recommendations around the first 2 years of the program, and you can see we spent a lot of time in the presentation today talking about that. We're recommending that people emphasize the mastery of a specialized field of study for the dissertation and basically a broad historical knowledge in other fields as ways of sort of dealing with this issue of whether or not it's even possible at this point, given the advancement of historical knowledge, to comprehensively master a field. We've asked for more opportunities for collaboration to be built into the first 2 years of the PhD program. We want departments to reconsider the meaning of professional development and facilitate opportunities for students to pursue other kinds of hard and soft skills, including outside of history departments, to address the increasingly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary way that we're doing history these days. We've recommended that departments look into work integrated learning. We've asked them to think about whether or not examinations are the best way of evaluating knowledge. And as part of this, we've also asked them to look into the language exam and whether or not it's required for specific fields of study and what kinds of assessments would actually measure competency in terms of a language exam. For the dissertation, we've asked them to think about some of the things that John talked about so well today, potentially shorter dissertations that have portfolio models that incorporate other types of doing history, including digital humanities projects. We've also recommended that departments consider processes for allowing community members to serve as examiners in certain situations. And that all of this is embedded through all stages of the process. So, departments need to ensure that their T&P documents also acknowledge the value of community-based research and different types of research dissemination, as those documents in turn impact how it is that we train PhD students. One thing we didn't talk about very much today is supervision, and we do have a number of recommendations around supervision in the report. We've recommended that every department outline expectations of the advisory relationship for faculty and students. This might include things like deadlines around returning student work, providing lists for field exams at a certain time, the frequency of meetings that people have. We also were really struck by the promise of co-supervision. There are departments that require every student to be co-supervised, or thinking about involved committees that really actually ask every committee member to be involved as a way of sort of ensuring that students have access to a broader group of mentors. We also felt that one of the things that we've heard as we've been working over the past year is that there's only so much we can do. Faculty members already have a lot on their plates, right? But there are a lot of resources already existing in our universities to deal with some of these things, like co-op, for example. There's grad skill pros things at Concordia, for example. So there's all sorts of workshops on campus for students to negotiate their way through the PhD. And we as supervisors don't need to provide everything. So becoming aware of what those resources are on campus and encouraging students to access them. At Guelph, we right now have a career counselor just for PhD students, for example. So we also, looked into ways that departments reward grad supervision. We have sort of mixed recommendations around this. We see it's helpful to recognize the workload involved in supervising graduate students, but we also need to be careful about systems that encourage supervisors to take on more students than they can appropriately supervise. And finally, the funding issue, which I talked about today. We were really encouraged by departments that arrange funding packages so that students can forego TA-ships at key times when they should be intensively focusing on research, especially for people who are traveling. And we recognize that, of course, most departments have little control over the funding that they can provide graduate students. Even so, we hope that departments do everything they can to increase the funding for PhD students, including making it clear to other levels of administration the inadequacy of the current funding. And this may involve working with university development offices to raise funds for awards. There are some history departments that have substantially private endowments for scholarships, and that is of considerable benefit to the students in those programs. We also made a whole series of recommendations to the CHA, which, as Steve mentioned, the CHA has already adopted. So our report is lengthy. It's almost 60 pages. But there's, I think, a lot of food for thought in it. And I hope that this presentation today has given you a sort of a window into some of the thinking of the committee and some of the ideas that we came up with. And that you'll reach into the report to get a broader sense of some of the work we've been doing and some of the transformations that could help to change and make our programs better.
Certainly with the Canadian Historical Association Council, we're already moving forward on various points that were raised in the report. We've struck a committee, or will strike a committee, on developing a tenure and promotion sort of guidelines. There's already ones that exist with the AHA. I think it was 2017. But I think it's an important conversation to have around that. We'll continue with the professional development workshops. And I think the big thing is really trying to push, like the people on the science side have pushed, the funding councils, right? To give out more grants, to have the grants worth more, and to increase the duration. And the duration issue is a really important one for historians, since we do have that, that field work, that is research intensive. It tends to be one of the reasons why I think our PhDs take longer than others. And so I think the funding councils need to acknowledge that and respect that. And I also really appreciate the committee's call on us to, push the Federation of the Humanities and Social Sciences on this issue, which, hasn't been particularly vocal on issues of precarity or on this issue. And so I think it's an important opportunity for us to really, take a wider leadership role within the academy. And I can go on, like there were other suggestions. So I just want to, I think from all of us here, I want to thank, the 7 committee members. It's a really important report that is, I think, a call to a clarion call for all of us to, make, I think, fundamental changes, right? To make sure that time to completion, at the very least, is in sync, right, with funding packages. But also, in alignment with learning goals and so on, and to sort of, acknowledge and understand that the outcomes in terms of where people end up is different now than it was 30 years ago. I think our programs have to sort of deal with that in a more substantial way. So if everyone could sort of just applause and thank the committee members for incredible work. They're also willing to speak to your department. So if your department wants to open up a conversation around this, a committee member would be willing to come into your department to walk people through, sort of the main substantive learning that they've got, the main research points. And that way open up a conversation within your department. So if you want to have that I don't want to say service, but that help, right? I know Catherine and the rest of the committee are willing to do that. So thank you all. Thank everyone for being here, but thank you all for doing this really great work. And we should all just read the report and spend time with it. So thank you so much. Merci bien.